You have your Bibles, church? Let me see. Hold them up. Good. Open up to James 4, please. James chapter 4. We're going to have our text coming. Our study is going to come from that text tonight. We're going to catch the end of chapter 3 going into 4. Where did they go? All right. There is a pair of glasses that were left up here on the podium this morning. And they're not here now, so they may have been taken back to the back. So if for some reason you can't see me tonight, you'll know where they are. And they already took care of them. So hopefully, if they're yours, you can now see what we're talking about tonight. I mentioned this morning that it's really an exciting time to be a member at Highland Heights. It really is. And it is for the family that is here. The people in this congregation are loving, they're hardworking. They are fervent in their love for God. It is also an exciting time because of the adventure that we have presented to us here soon with the prospect of a new building. And I mentioned it to you this morning. It's still over here. If you haven't gone over to take a look at this sign that we've been keeping track of our payment on the new property, then let me just say there's 3 really awesome words across it: paid in full. God has been very generous to us. You have had very generous hearts, and our elders have shown a lot of wisdom in the way that they have managed this. We are now sitting in a very great place financially to be able to have taken care of this as we look forward to the next several months in which we're going to be building this new building. And I, for one, am excited about it. I think it is a great, great opportunity. But being ready to undertake a major building project for the first time in over 30 years, there is also an aspect about this project that I think is important that we, as a family at Highland Heights, keep in mind. Because I think we need to recognize that in the next several months, and perhaps even the few months after, while it's going to be a great time of excitement, it's also going to be a great time for us to be tested as a family. Churches all over the world build buildings all the time. And for the most part, they do just fine. But we've all heard the horror stories, haven't we? Perhaps some of you have even been witness to those horror stories of congregations that have beat themselves up over the details and the stresses of a building, saying things to one another that they would normally not say, getting bent out of shape about things that normally they wouldn't get bent out of shape about. The arguments over how much should we spend on this building? What about the layout of the building? Hey, what color paint are we going to put on the walls? And what color or design is the carpet going to have? And what kind of chairs are we going to put in the auditorium? What kind of chairs are we going to have in the classrooms? Oh, what demographic didn't get enough attention paid to them when we planned out this building? These are the kinds of things that do have a tendency to crop up in projects like this. And again, while I think it is true that the vast majority of churches don't suffer any major damages during those months and years that they work on them, sadly, there are some who have. Some who have harmed themselves almost irreparably. Perhaps the worst case scenario being those in which congregations have split over it. With that being said, I think it's really good that over the last few weeks we have been spending time in our personal Bible studies on the book of James. Because nestled in the midst of his letter, James begins to address this very kind of issue. No, not building new church buildings, but rather James addresses the presence of, and I think can also be understood to address the prevention of church conflicts. If you were to open up to James chapter 4, verse 1, James says, "What is it that causes quarrels among you?" Now, a couple of things to note about this. Sometimes when we see this idea of quarrels, Our minds begin to go outside of our church buildings. We begin to think about the quarrels that we have with people of the world, those that are not part of our number. And we know that that's going to happen, right? I mean, if you just simply live the Christian life the way that God has called you to live it, there are going to be times that you find yourself in conflict with people who do not share your faith. But in this passage, James is not talking about those kinds of conflicts. He's not talking about the ideological run-ins that we have with people out in the world. When he says what causes quarrels among you, he means the church. He means Christians, those within inside our own individual congregations. Given that James is writing to a large group of congregations, I think you could also say that these are squabbles that happen between different churches. What causes this to happen? And then I think it's also interesting to note when he says quarrels, what's happening there? You see, the word here for quarrels, he's not talking about these pithy little fights. The word quarrels that is used here in James chapter 4, verse 1 is the same word that you would use for wars and battles. Hand-to-hand combat, so to speak. And so it seems to me that we understand that what he's talking about here is not, he's not talking about the odd random conflict, the little scuffle that you might have with your friend. We know those happen, right? I mean, you get irritated at somebody from time to time, and you kind of get a little snarky with them, and hopefully you go handle it properly. But he's not talking about the small little scuffles and snarky moments that we have. He's talking about those incidences that happen within churches that actually become a big stink, in which congregations begin to get divided, in which people begin to buddy up together, and you start seeing that this segment believes this group this way, and then there's a bunch over there that think this way, and then there maybe even a third and fourth group that all think this way, and none of them can get along. None of them can solve this problem. Tonight, what I'd like for us to do is I'd like for us to take a few minutes, and I want us to see what James says in this passage about what I think is one of the most crucial topics to the sanctity of the Lord's church. And mind you, I don't want to talk about this because I think that there's a problem here right now, okay? A lot of times we don't start delving into these kinds of topics until there's something wrong. As far as I can tell, we're not having that kind of issue at Highland Heights. God be praised, amen? We're not battling that, but I would rather like for us to see this as an opportunity to defend ourselves against the wiles of Satan, as a preparation for times to come. I've said it before, I had a good friend of mine down in Texas that he used to make the comment, and when things went really, really well at Woodland Oaks for a while, he would come up to me every so often, he said, "Cory, things have gone really well for a long time, and to be honest, sometimes it makes me a little nervous because when things get to going too well for too long, that's when Satan has a tendency to sneak his foot in the door." And we don't want to see that happen here. Whether it's about this new building or whether it is about anything that comes down the road. This building is not going to be the identity of Highland Heights. It is not going to mark all of our heritage and all of our legacy. There will be many, many more years, God willing. And so what we want to be able to do, we want to know how it is that we can ward off such quarrels and fights now while there aren't any going on, so that hopefully it will help us make sure that later on down the road, when we start seeing the grumblings or we start seeing those opportunities, we can do what is necessary to keep them at bay. So what do we need to do? What do we need to learn from the book of James? We're actually going to back up and we're going to begin in chapter 3. And I want to read verses 13 through 18. And the first thing I want you to note is that if we're going to avoid quarrels and wars within the Lord's church, we need to understand that godly wisdom is the best place to operate from. Read with me these verses if you don't mind, beginning in chapter 3, verse 13. "Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth, because this is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but rather it is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. I don't know if you catch it or not, but there is an awful lot that is packed into those few verses alone. We could very well spend almost a whole sermon series just on those 5 or 6 verses in and of themselves. But in a broad statement, here's what I hope you saw happening. In the broad statement, what we saw here was the contrast between godly wisdom and earthly wisdom. And he uses some very strong language, doesn't he? It is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. One of the things to remember as you come to the book, anywhere within the book of James, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, is that from the outset of the letter, James has been pointing his readers to the need to think with and to understand and operate from a position of godly wisdom. If you were to flip back to chapter 1, verse 5, almost again from the very outset of the book, what does he say? If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously and without reproach. As you keep moving your way through chapter 1 in verse 17, he says that every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. And I know a lot of times we think about gifts in the broadest sense, but if you keep it in its context, what is the good gift that he's talking about in James 1:17? He's not talking in a specific context about every gift, but specifically, he is talking about wisdom. All the wisdom of God that we possess, that we utilize, is a gift from Him. We see this moving on in chapter 1, verse 22, in which he's encouraging the use of this wisdom to be doers of the word and not hearers only. And then as you come into chapter 2, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 12, we find that James goes through a handful of external ways of living out that wisdom that God has gifted to those who have asked. He tells us that we show it by not showing partiality when we gather together. Not making sure that we have faith that is substantiated by our good deeds. Controlling our tongue in the way in when we teach and when we speak. And then coming up into chapter 3, verse 13, he sums all of that up with the question of who is wise and understanding among you. I like what Daniel Aiken says about that particular verse. He says that the man or woman of wisdom and knowledge who measures up to God's standards, this is the one who proves to be such by attitudes and good actions. The coupling of the two words, wise and understanding, has in view the truth and its application. The objective truth is that God is gracious. And the subjective application is that the wise humble themselves in obedience. Both of these concepts are embodied in the wise man or woman. Godly wisdom is the place to operate from. It is the knowledge of God, the knowledge of God's ways and of His teachings, and then it is the application of those things that brings for us the idea of understanding. Now, we know in this earthly existence, and for every good thing that there is, there's most likely going to be an opposite evil thing, right? And in verses 14 and 15, we find what that opposite of godly wisdom is. He gives us that contrast. But if you have bitter jealousy, selfish ambition in your hearts, don't boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. One of the things I found interesting in looking through that description, if you are filled with bitter jealousy, did you know that the word jealousy in the New Testament, it's the same word that is used for zeal or passion. And so what you find happening is that you can use the word in a very positive way, or you can use the word in a very negative way. We tend to think of zeal as something that's good, being zealous for God, zealous for good works. But what he has described here is that jealousy is a bitter zealousness. A bitter earnestness for something that you want. And when you pair it with that idea of selfish ambition, another good word that we could use to describe what this is, it's the concept of envy. Wanting something that's not yours. Looking out at those who possess something that you want and perhaps being willing to do whatever's necessary in order to get it. And what he wants us to see here is that there is nothing spiritual and holy about envying the position and possessions of others. And so when it comes to our lives, when it comes to the everyday conduct, depending upon which one of these positions we choose to operate from, godly wisdom or unspiritual, demonic, earthly wisdom, the outcomes are going to be very, very different. If we allow ourselves to operate from envy, what is it going to result in? He says right there, it is going to result in disorder. Chaos is going to emerge from it in every vile practice. But godly wisdom generates very, very different fruits. When we have the humility and the reverence for God and His ways and the respect for other people, notice the things again that he says in verse 17. The wisdom from above is pure, peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And what's the harvest? The harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. You know, church, the truth of the matter, it's really not that complicated of a concept. Godly wisdom involves a genuine concern for the conduct of one's life. If I'm operating by godly wisdom, I am genuinely concerned about how I conduct myself in public and among my church family. And as Christians who want godly wisdom, I think we would all say that respect toward other persons is entirely appropriate because it reflects respect toward God. If I love and I respect my Creator, then I'm going to love and respect other people. But the flip side of that, I think we should also recognize that sins toward other people are going to find their roots in sins toward God. If we are rebelling against our God and above, who are we to think that we're going to treat other people kindly and with respect? When the heart is possessed by envy, then a cruel rivalry and sinful longing for what belongs to another is always going to be involved. And so as we go into this church building project and as we go into the future of Highland Heights and all of the other things that God has in store for this congregation in the decades to come, we need to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that godly wisdom is the best place to operate from in order to maintain peace. There can be no other option. We must each as individuals decide it, and we must as a congregation decide that this is how we will live. But should we begin to see envy creeping in and leading us toward those quarrels, then I think it is also helpful for us to understand where the source of quarrels actually comes from. This brings us to James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. What causes quarrels? And what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you. You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you do not receive because you ask wrongly in order to spend it on your passions. In short, the reason why quarrels happen, the source of quarrels, they happen because we are not operating from godly wisdom, right? I mean, that's really the short answer. But what happens in these verses is that James will go a little bit deeper into the explanation by pointing out that the external battles that are taking place when churches are fighting amongst themselves, the external battles that are taking place, they are taking place because we are waging wars internally. They don't start on the outside. They start on the inside. Literally, what he says there in verse 1, is it not that our pleasures are at war with the members of our body? That's literally what it says. And I will say this, it may not be, as we look through the book of James and we look at the passage, it may not be the case that the desires he is talking about are inherently evil in and of themselves. I mean, we're people. There are things that we're going to want, right? And that in and of itself is not the problem, that we want something. Where the conflict begins to come up, it's the conflict of having desires, of me wanting something, maybe a couple of different things, and I can't get all of it at once. I can't have both of the things that I want, because if I get one, then it cancels out the other. Or maybe I want something that's not that it's not my right to have. And so when you can't get everything that you want, now you have to learn how to cope with it. And therein lies the conflict. Our body, we are at war with the desires inside of us. And what happens is that the quarrels, when the quarrels of our life happen, they happen when our coping mechanism, you didn't get what you want, so now you're trying to figure out how to deal with it. When our coping mechanism takes on the form of sinful actions, that's when quarrels happen. Notice what he says in verses 2 and 3 again. You desire and don't have, and so you murder. You covet and you cannot obtain, so you fight and you quarrel. You don't have because you don't ask, and you ask and don't receive because you ask wrongly in order to spend it on your passions. I mean, and notice, how far-reaching this goes. It's not just interpersonal. You didn't get what you wanted, and so you lashed out at the other person involved. But he says it even turns around and it affects the way that you speak to God. Oh, you may have been praying for it and you're asking God, please give it, please give me this, please give me this. And God doesn't give it because what does God see? God sees it deep down. You don't want it for His glory. You want it because you're selfish. And I want it because I want to see something great happen in my life. And when God can look into our hearts and see that we're not asking with the right motives, He's not going to give it to us. And the question is, how do I cope with that? And I will add this. I don't know if you caught this up at the end of chapter 3, right there in verse 14. He said, if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. See, I think one of the things that James is calling his readers out on here is that they are claiming to know the wisdom of God, but they are operating with the demonic wisdom of the selfish world. They are operating behind the mask of faith. They speak the language, they do the actions, they come to services, but deep down in their hearts, there's something else that's going on. And what is actually going on is that when our coping mechanisms for not having gotten what we wanted, when our coping mechanisms turn to sinful actions, I think that what it is showing is that there is a deep-seated failure within us to really understand the nature of God's wisdom. We haven't actually grasped what God wants of us with regard to wisdom yet. And if you go down through the book of James, you'll find that this has actually been the underlying problem that James has dealt with all the way through the book. In James 1:13, he said, "Do not say, I am being tempted by God." Well, why would anybody say that? Well, if you pay attention in the previous few verses, he talked about going through trials. And the person who doesn't understand the person who does not understand the reason we go through trials, when you don't understand the purpose and the value of trials in your lives, then you might be tempted to say, well, God's the one that's leading me to sin. That's not what's happening. You don't understand the wisdom of God if you're blaming God for the temptation in your life. And in chapter 2, verse 18, when he says, you show me your faith without your works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. He's addressing a misunderstanding that faith is somehow able to be disconnected from our actions. That can't be the case. You don't understand the wisdom of God if you think faith and actions don't go hand in hand. In chapter 3, verses 9 through 12, he addresses the idea of that from the same mouth come blessings and come cursing. It is a misunderstanding of God's wisdom to believe that somehow we can be filled with the wisdom of God and let our tongues run wild and say whatever it is we want to say. And then here in chapter 4, 1 through 3, that we can wear this mask of faith, we can speak the language of the church, and yet still have envy and covetousness take hold of our hearts. You don't understand the wisdom of God if you think you can operate like that for long. As one commentator put it, the lack of wisdom and of undivided trust in God results in a terribly distorted view of one's relationship with God. And I think that's what's happening right here. I think that's what James is outlining. That when quarrels are happening, what's really taking place is that for those who are involved in it, for those who find themselves right in the thick of it, it's not, they think they're operating from faith, but they're really not. They're operating from covetousness and envy and spite. And they don't really understand what the wisdom of God is and what it's supposed to look like in life. And church, I'm here to tell you that if we're going to avoid the quarrels and wars that can divide our ranks, then we need to understand where those quarrels come from. They don't come from out there. They come from in here. They come from our own covetous hearts and our own misunderstanding of God's wisdom. Which leaves us asking the question, well, if we start facing them, then what's the solution? What must we do? What must we follow in order to keep these things from creeping in? And this is found in chapter 4, verses 7 through 10. The answer to keeping all of these quarrels away is submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will be the one to exalt you. The only way that we will come to understand and experience the wisdom of God is to get on our knees before Him. It's the only way that His church can avoid, overcome, and repair damages caused by wars within our own ranks. And do you notice what drawing near to God entails? He says you need to cleanse your hands. That means you need to stop doing all of the actions that are causing the damage to begin with. We must purify our hearts. We must rid ourselves of those sinful attitudes and that envy that lies deep down within inside of us. He says, be wretched and mourn and weep. I think it gives us this notion that we need to stop taking any semblance of pride in being the ones who caused the trouble. You ever met somebody like that? They actually got excited about the fact that they stirred everything up, that they're the ones that brought it all to light. Yeah, you did. And now God tells you you need to cry for what's happened. We need to rid ourselves of any pride that we have coming before our God. Church, there really, really is. There's a lot to be excited about at Highland Heights. But as I said before, I think those are often the times that Satan can sneak his foot through the crack in the door and start causing trouble. And we don't want that to happen, amen? We don't want it to happen now. We don't want it to happen 2 years from now, 10 years from now, a generation from now. And so our prayer is that God may give us the fortitude, the wisdom, the awareness, and the discipline to not ever let that happen, now or ever. Maybe it is tonight that you're here and you realize that you're operating from a wisdom that is not godly. Maybe you are living that unspiritual, demonic wisdom of life, full of envy and strife and contention. The question simply tonight is, will you submit to God? Will you cleanse your hands, purify your heart, come to Him in humility and sorrow for the sin in your life? Or will you defiantly walk out of this room tonight as though there's nothing wrong, saying to yourself, well, maybe next time? See, the problem, church, is that we're not promised next time. James will also say in his letter, what is your life? It's but a vapor. Appears for a moment and then vanishes into the air. We are allotted this moment, and this moment only. And as a good friend of mine has said before, God, if you are sitting here now, then what that lets us know is that God has spared your life to this moment to give you one more opportunity to get your life right with Him. Do you need to become a Christian? Do you need to deal with sin in your life? You have an opportunity. What will you do with it right now while we stand and sing?